Hello, everyone. Welcome to the React Native Show podcast, which is brought to you by CallStack, a total software engineering consultancy. In today's topic, we're going back to the roots. Usually on our episodes, we discuss a lot of different things about engineering, but we are mostly focused about React and React Native. So for the past few episodes, we've been discussing React Native for TVs, React Native for VR. Both episodes dropped in December, I think. And today we're gonna stitch both topics together and talk about React Multiplatform and code sharing in React Native. So to help me do that, I invited a wonderful guest from London, from Edinburgh, apparently, Mo Javad, who is the head of mobile at Theodore UK, and who is also an organizer of React Native London. Hello, Mo. How are you?
Great to be with you, Łukasz. I'm very excited to be here today. Like you mentioned, up and down in the UK between London and Edinburgh. Very cold this time of year, but very warm with the excitement of speaking about React Native and talking about Universal React Native soon.
Yeah, awesome. So let's start. Let's start maybe with some context and history and theory about multi-platform and code sharing in general. So can you brief us on how it's been done for the past decades in IT industry?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting kind of concept with this whole multi-platform idea. Let's go to roots, and I want to kind of phrase this in the most primitive way, and then maybe we can build up from there. So if you've ever seen the project management triangle, have you ever seen that, Łukasz? Yeah. So it's you've got scope, cost, and time. And to me, when you're building an application, let's say you have a web team and you've got an iOS native team and you've got an Android native team, maybe you want to support, Microsoft Windows phones back in the day, or whatever else you may have. You have an elevated scope at that point because, you're developing things 4 or 5 times in different technologies. And so that severely either increases the cost and time that you have to develop those features, or you need to reduce the scope, right, across these different platforms to keep things feature parity. And so then you had these sort of ideas of, well, why do we need to build these things multiple times? Could we potentially reuse and try to use a technology that abstracts that away? And so, you had the likes of Xamarin, which we're not going to get into because why would you? And there's these efforts to go down the multi-platform route. And to me, the idea with multi-platform is maximizing your team's productivity. You don't want teams to be rebuilding things across different tech. You want them to be focused on the features that they're building. And you want to let the tech enable them to deliver at the best quality that they can, at the fastest speed that they can. And so this is why multi-platform is so exciting for me. I think the idea with multi-platform for me is enabling product companies to build products rather than grappling with tech and fighting with tech all the time.
Yeah, so I remember when I first started my programming career, I was an Android developer, and then I found out about the React XP, which is, we'll get into that later. And that opened my eyes when I saw that I could use some web technologies to try to write iOS and Android at the same time and web at the same time, because that one was for web as well.
Yeah.
And then I rediscovered React Native, and then I rediscovered React Native Web. And all of that is a great concept, like you said. It has a lot of benefits, and we've been discussing the benefits on this podcast. In each episode, we say about the less cost to produce the application, the time to market decrease, stuff like that. It also has its drawbacks. So let's talk about that as well. Let's not forget the.
And I had a very similar journey to you, Łukasz. So for me, when I started development in my spare time back when I was in school, I went through Dreamweaver. I don't know if you remember Dreamweaver. They had this functionality where you could take images, pop them into a website, and you could select parts of the image to highlight as a link. So that's where I started off. And then I was doing mobile, so I built my first iOS app in the Objective-C days before Swift was out, and it was absolutely painful. And I really did not enjoy that process. And, web was a lot more culpable for me. So going from React to React Native, felt like a natural step, right? You've got this like really nice declarative way to define UIs. Everything is a lot simpler, and you have to think about what you're building, not the instructions that you give the computer to execute the UI in a certain way that you want. And, I think that was a much nicer way to build UIs. The web felt a lot more deterministic to me. And I think that was probably the sentiment that a lot of native developers had, right? Both on the iOS space and the Android space. You had these imperative models for designing UIs, and it's not as convenient and it's not as nice as the declarative approaches. So it was only natural that you see React.
Also, there are two different models. So when you split your scope into stories, into tasks to do, those may be different tasks for each platforms. It's not even if the UI is the same, the splitting of the UI into smaller components might not be.
So yeah, like exactly. Your architecture is going to be fundamentally different depending on the platform, and so there's a lot of work that comes with that. And React, I think, was natural that people wanted to take that paradigm and bring it to the native world, and I think that's where React Native was such a natural step to go, right? You've got such a great sort of agnostic UI library. Why not use it to build native apps in a much more convenient way for native developers?
So I forgot to mention in the beginning of the episode. So sorry everyone that is listening, but the structure for today's episode is right now we'll be geeking for maybe 10 minutes about the history and about the approaches that we could take to share UI, to share business logic, stuff like that, to share styles, maybe animations, and then we want to jump into the business case that Mo recently had with the multi-platform streaming service. And I also work in very similar project on our end. So we have very comparable projects, and we can talk about some solutions, some particular solutions that we employ in those business cases. So sorry for that. Let's go back to geeking out about the context and history, and then we will go into more specific use cases.
Yeah.
So context and history. So I already mentioned React XP.
Yeah.
That approach is one of the examples, I would say, of building a bridging layer between React for web and React Native for mobile. And then having it has different components. They are named differently, but under the hood, they really link to proper like view from React Native and like div from web, let's say. And that product, that library was used in Skype for years. I'm not sure if it's still the case. Probably not, but who knows? But that is one of the approaches.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of like attempts early on. I think people, when React Native came out, it was like, okay, let's go from web to mobile, and we abstracted away to views, text, and sort of very, very basic primitives that aren't, platform specific. And then I think people were like, wait a second, can't we just like take this and use it for web as well? Like this, surely we should be able to share this, right? And I think React XP is definitely an example. I don't know if you remember, React Primitives was another example. And then styled components jumped into the mix for some reason and decided, we're going to see if we can make some primitives. And then there was the universal styled components UI library. I don't know if you remember that. And then, React Native for web was kind of going along in here. And it was really cool. There was a lot of focus on sharing the visual layer, which I think was fascinating. But, I think we started this whole like universal journey at Theodo back in, I want to say 2018, when we actually started off on a project called mate.com. It's like a furniture store on the web, and it's now owned by Next Fashion, I think. And we were trying to really explore this universal concept because they knew they wanted to go React. They needed a full sort of transformation of their UI stack on mobile and web, and we really dug into this concept of like, can we use React Native for web at that point in 2018, 2019? And we looked at all of these different options, and I think we played around with it a lot. And one of the things that we were concerned about was like, is the visual layer ready yet? And we can talk about where that state is today. I think it's going to be very interesting. But the challenges back then that we had was, SEO was a big worry. We were not convinced that in a production app we could get good SEO, and I think a lot of people shared similar sentiments back then. And SSR was hard to get working well with something like Next.js in the early days. It's gotten so much smoother now, and there's so many adapters that kind of just do it for you.
But what did sorry, I missed that. What did you end up using back then?
This is what we ended up doing, which was we decided, we're not going to actually use the visual layer, but we opted for a lighter version of a quote, quote, universal app where we said business logic, API calls, all of the sort of non-visual layer stuff, we opted to share, and we kind of isolated those into packages. And the visual layer, we decided, this isn't something that we're going to be able to share in a way that we felt satisfied with, was kind of ready for production at that point.
Okay, so you basically, in 2018, you basically had the same design for web and for, let's say, for mobile web version, and you build it twice. Once in HTML, let's say React, and once in React Native proper.
Yeah, at that point, that's what we opted to do, because we really felt, in terms of something like, especially an e-commerce platform, where you really value something like search engine optimization, where you really value like performance at a max. We just didn't think it was the point where that was going to warrant such an important sort of like business case for these guys. And so ultimately we really opted against it, but there's still so much to share, right? Like the visual layer is only a component of what you really need to share in a universal app. And I think the vision stuck with us, right? The vision was, there's so much that you can share. There's so much that we want to share. And ultimately that's what we've been working towards since then.
I always, on this kind of episodes, I always try to build up like a scale, like a spectrum of possibilities. In TVs, we did this in some other episodes as well. So let's try to put all of those examples on a scale. Let's say on the left-hand side, you have zero code sharing. You have native mobile iOS, Android you have native web, let's say. And on the right-hand side, you have share everything. So in case of your approach, you are sharing the business logic, which is, let's say, some kind of Redux or something like that, and the API calls.
The API calls, the constants, the configs, all of that stuff.
But the visual layer stays separate.
The visual layer stays separate. I think an important point for me to mention, though, which I think I missed, is there's certain things in the visual layer in terms of styling primitives, design tokens, that type of stuff that we did still share as sort of like a config of sorts, but the rest of the components themselves, that was stuff that we opted not to share. So if you go into the spectrum, it was kind of like very light React universe, very light universal React type of.
The spectrum is not linear. It's not only dimension, it's probably several different dimensions, because like you said, the styles, like the how do I say that? The design language of the product is the same across all of the platforms. So also, like, even if you think about such easy concepts as translations, that's also shared in all of the products, but we don't usually think about this part as code sharing, but probably maybe we should. So your example is somewhere near the left-hand side. My example with React XP and probably with React Native Web as well, it's more about sharing the whole application. So it's more near the center of the right-hand side. But back then, when I started, and the timeline that you are describing, you couldn't really squeeze in all the things that you wanted from... You couldn't find a solution all the way to the right, all the way to the code share everything. So what's the multi-platform state of solutions today? Are we all the way to the right already?
I love that you described that spectrum, because I think we're gonna be using that a lot to go through the options, right? So let's go through the choices today, and I think this is really, really valuable to look at. I think let's go to the very left of the spectrum is going to be you share absolutely nothing, just have native apps, don't even use React Native. Cool. Now then we go a little bit more to the left. Well, we go a little bit more to the right. You have maybe a React app, you have a React Native app, you can do what we did on Mate, right? You try to extract out bits of business logic, extract out bits of things like translations, things that are really just fundamentally shareable. And the underrated, I like to call them the underrated shareable parts of a React and React Native app.
NPM libraries.
Yeah, precisely. Like there's so much that you can share. It's really a shame not to. And oftentimes, just to take a little bit of a caveat with this, oftentimes when, I meet someone and I'm speaking to them and they already have a React web app and they're thinking of building a React Native app, they haven't gone down the universal route. But to me, they can still benefit from this concept of multi-platform React. You can still go in and abstract some of your business logic and re-architecture slightly your web app in a way that it just accelerates your build of your native app with React Native. So I think there's that level. And then we get into the like hybrid universal apps where I think you start to share parts of your UI. You maybe share your, UI components, your atoms, your molecules, your organisms from your design system. And you share parts of the screen, part of the more complex components, but you maybe handle layouting differently. And then, like you say, there's different dimensions here. Like what bundlers do you use for this, right? Do you use like Webpack across web and mobile and maybe use Repack under the hood for the mobile side? Do you use Metro for native, and then do you use Webpack for web? Like you can start to add a lot of these elements.
Do you use Metro for web as well? And
I think that's where it gets to the very, very far end of it, which is like, let's just use far right. Let's just use Metro for absolutely everything, and we'll go into that. That's kind of what we opted for with the streaming platform, which we'll talk about in a bit later. But I think you're
using Metro in production for web?
We're using Metro in production, well, to be released into production very soon, into web. Okay. We are, which is we'll talk about part of the challenges with that as well.
Let me note down a question about this.
Oh goodness me, this is gonna be scary.
Yeah.
But I think a really optimized approach that I like, and it's one that we're doing for another client, which is for like a sports client, is trying to really leverage React Native for web, but maybe not trying to push to the bundler level. And what that means is, you use an Next.js site and you use that because it's de facto the way that you should be building production React apps. And you use something like Expo for the native side, which will accelerate and give you some of the same DevX experience that you get on the website. And sure, you're not sharing 100%. There's going to be some stuff that you won't be able to share. And that's fine. You accept that and you go for a little bit more of a platform optimized approach, but I think one that will benefit the client and get them the best quality across all of these. Just to go on the Metro one, and then there's the concept of universal apps across the full scale, right? The far right example, as Łukasz liked to say. So I think that one is very interesting because you get the release of Expo Router, which is a full on Metro basically. And this concept of like, let's even share the navigation, let's share the bundler, let's just go with one centralized approach. And I think long term, this is actually a really exciting vision for me because you reduce so much complexity, and you take out the complexity of managing these different runtimes, of managing different bundlers, different navigation systems, trying to use Next.js's tools as well as maybe some of the Expo tools or just a bare React Native apps tools. And I think that to me is quite an exciting prospect because again, it opens the doors and makes things much more accessible. A lot more businesses can build out universal apps. Now, are we there yet? What do you think?
Oh, okay. So that's time for me to chime in. I was going to challenge that actually because you say this is a very exciting future, and let's say I agree with the exciting future part, but is it the right approach long term? Because you have so much knowledge and so much know-how and so much good practices and so much just people and industries building upon Next.js, building upon HTML, all the different web technologies.
Yeah.
And then it's a trade-off, right? If you're building a product it has some edge conditions that you don't care about all of the know-how. You just care about time to market. You care about the visibility. Let's use the newest and greatest and far right approach to have the universal app from Expo.
Yeah.
For web as well. But if you care about engineering talent, about people who are able to squeeze in the last 0.5% of performance from your application, they won't be able to debug the Metro for web for some specific use cases right now.
Yeah.
Maybe in a few years' time when more people try to use it, that's possible.
Yeah.
But right now with, there are existing, of course, there are existing architecture patterns of how to make things work at scale. And I'm not sure if it is a use case for some use cases, but it's not for that everyone should start using far right, let's culture everything.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's you have to, as with all things with tech, you need to take a very nuanced approach with a lot of these things, because I think you have to really see what's important to that specific project. I'm very I'm looking forward to going through the choices that we made and why we ultimately ended up with going for the far right Metro for web. We got to stop saying far right. The Metro for web universal app. But just to wrap that part up, I think, can you code share everything? I don't think you can even when you go for that approach, right? Because there's going to be certain external libraries that just will not work properly for your use case on web, and maybe they work well on mobile. And you have to even start thinking about certain libraries you may need to choose different implementations on the web and abstract them away in different APIs. Certain behaviors are going to be different on web compared to mobile. And so you will still need to, it will not just work magically out of the box, right? You as the engineer will need to make those trade-offs.
Yeah.
And so is it ever going to be fully universal? No, but I think we're pretty damn close.
Yeah, to draw the conclusion from what you said, in our existing ecosystem of Android, mobile, web, TV, VR maybe, it is not possible. It would have been possible for something like Java Virtual Machine, right?
Yeah.
You'd have to have the same environment on all of those.
Dare I say platforms. It? I'm gonna say it, and you're gonna hate me for this. As my friend Taz Singh used to say, this is the big F word that I'm not allowed to say. Or in the case of Flutter, something like that is possible. But like you say, it's possible when you nail the environments down. But you also, when you build a system like that, you need to make sure everyone either has the JVM basically installed on their machine, which we don't want to go back to those days because those days sucked. Or you render everything in a canvas on web and then lose out on all of the web native features, right? There's a trade-off with that as well. And so I think we need to really do respect these platform specific intricacies, whether it be native apps or the web. The web is a phenomenal piece of tech. We're not going to replace it with some canvas that just renders everything.
I don't want that.
That's not realistic, right?
Yeah. So we are in the part when we are geeking out about the different possibilities on the spectrum. We already said that the spectrum is not one dimension, it's probably two or more dimensions. I think the one dimension that we care about the most in React Native, React world, is the business logic visual layer kind of spectrum. All the rest of them are in the different on the different places on y-axis. We are moving across the x-axis. Do you want to stay here for a little bit more and maybe discuss the possibilities for what exactly can we share? Let's do that.
I think that's important. So I actually did a talk on this last year, which was universal apps. What should you share? What's the state of what you can share? And so roughly the categories that I kind of broke it out to was like UI, right? Just the rendering and the components that you have, navigation, business logic, and then things like your adapter layers to network calls or external services or so on and so forth. And React being platform agnostic, you can use React to build UIs for anything, right? You can build a CLI with React, right? And that's the beauty of React. React DOM is just an implementation. one of the things with React, which I think is quite nice about it, is that you've got the same hooks across the board with React Native or React on DOM, and you've got the same systems in place and the same JavaScript logic that you write there. So all of that you can share just kind of naturally. Things like navigation becomes more difficult depending on what situation you're in, right? Because if you're going down the universal Expo Router app approach with Metro, then yeah, you can share navigation across the board, right? The tools are there for you to not even have to worry about the different environments when you're dealing with navigation. Now, there's some interesting caveats there around how that navigation renders and behaves across web and mobile. Like if you use a drawer on mobile, what does that look like on web? Or if you use a stack or a tab, how does that look like? And what do you need to think about with that? And I think there's some interesting things when you go into the Expo docs and look at the platform-specific layouting section under Expo Router, you'll see that if you want a mature application that's not an MVP, you do need to start thinking about layouting differently, because inherently layouts on web and mobile are different, right? And you don't want to maybe share those layouts. And the example that I usually bring with this is go onto the Twitter web app and put the Twitter mobile app right next to it, right? Things are just in different places. On the web app, you've got your main feed, you've got your navigation on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side, you've got your search and discover section. This is totally different on the native app, right? People expect different layouting on native apps. And so, you go into...
It's basically twisted the 90 degrees, right? Because you have search on the top, then you have your feed, and then you have your navigation.
Well, you've got your navigation, and the search on the native, at least iOS app, is actually in a different tab. And all of those discovers are in a different tab. So, it might even be that certain screens just don't have the same things on them. And so you can share the components, the atoms, a lot of the stuff you can share. But when you go to the top level layouting, sometimes it just doesn't make sense to share it if you want a refined experience. Now, again, it all kind of depends, right? At the end of the day, if you're just trying to launch an MVP, if you just want to get something out and you're a mobile first business, you're maybe a challenger bank that everyone's going to be using your mobile app for 90% of the time, and sometimes they're going to need a web implementation if they're on the go or they don't have their phone on them, then you can kind of compromise on some of these things, right? Because you're still trying to balance within that scope, cost, and time triangle. But I think there's these conscious decisions that need to be made architecturally around this.
Sure. Thanks for such a brief and deep overview.
I hope it wasn't confusing.
No. And I want to summarize this. Yeah. At Callstack, we have this term, which is React Universe. And React Universe basically means that if you are already plugged in, you are one leg into React Universe. You use, like you said, React on web, or you have React Native app, or even you are in JavaScript world at all. It's beneficial for you time-wise, work-wise, scope-wise, to get into the React Universe more, to plug in your mobile application, to plug in, to share your business logic in Redux or whatever other state management you have. And the way and the amount of code sharing is only dependent on your use case and what makes sense for your product. So we call it React Universe. And you don't even have to use...
And we call it Universal React, so we're very close by.
Yeah. So let's wrap it up. And from
just this, one final thing on this, which I think is really, and I think you hit this point, and it reminded me. I think one of the beautiful things about this is, you as a developer want to focus on developing, right? And a lot of these decisions go up to business stakeholders, right? You've got think of the C-level executives in a business, right? And I think this idea of universal React, using React across your entire sort of platform, the platforms that you're targeting, is a message that resonates with everyone in leadership. You can make it resonate with a CTO because you're reducing technical complexity, and they don't have 3 or 4 different teams. You can resonate with a CFO because you just say to them, you're cutting costs in the in the long term. It resonates with a CPO because the CPO doesn't have to manage like 4 different teams on different tech stacks and like making sure that everyone is going to release a feature at the same. Like everyone benefits from it. It's just
it resonates with HR because you streamline your recruiting process.
Yeah, and there's far more JavaScript developers out there than getting native developers and multiplying these across different teams. You know, it's such an amazing offering, and I think the future with this is going to be so exciting. I think it's only starting to be talked about more and more, and I think it's very exciting.
Okay, thanks. So now we are wrapping up the geeking out about the possibilities in code sharing, and we're jumping in the specific use case that you recently had and something that I'm also familiar with. So multi-platform streaming service. Tell us some more about the use case of your client.
So I without going into names because I'm not technically allowed to. We recently started having conversations with a client who was looking to build a streaming platform. Now, one of the things that we realized was they were targeting a market which was very heavy on mobile usage, but they also wanted to have a web platform as well. And one of the restraints that they had was they were really gunning to launch before a specific event that was happening in their country. And so they were like, we need to build this out quickly. We know we want to do mobile, but we really need web. And it was kind of like, how can we have everything while still being able to do this in time? And so I had really been immersed in the space of the universal app. And so we went and spoke to them about this concept of universal apps. We said, you want to build a streaming platform and you want to build it in 3 different devices effectively. First of all, React Native is a no-brainer. You should really go for React Native, but why not take that to the web as well? You are mobile first and you are targeting mobile users primarily, and you have a tight deadline. I think this is the only way that you can deliver. And so we really started exploring this concept of creating this universal streaming platform. And eventually down the line as well, once these folks are up and running, we know that they are targeting a TV app as well. And so naturally you can start to, again, share across that universe of React devices that can be targeted and use it for TV as well. So, it was just a no-brainer. And, with the limited capacity of developers that they had as well, we didn't really want to throw them down the deep end of go find a web developer, go find a TV developer, go find native developers. And, it was the right choice, I think, strategically for them long-term. So that's kind of an overview of how we came into this. Happy to jump into more if you have any specific things that you want me to cover as well.
Oh, no. So I already... So the main assumptions and limitations are obvious. Time to market is crucial. Mobile first, web second, and then maybe TV at some point in the future. So with those in mind, what is your timeline to... I didn't want to say timeline. What is your roadmap, for the strategic decisions that you have to do along the way to get this set up and running?
So that's a great question. Let me start from what was the timeline to get this out, right? So the timeline that we had to deliver this is 3 months for all 3 platforms, building features like full streaming. And you laugh at that. It was difficult, but we got there, which is fascinating. And I think this
I know that you have teams in all the time zones.
Yeah, well, we have teams in New York City, London, and France, and I think we leveraged all 3 of those time zones. So, -5, +0, and +1, if you're looking on the time zone scale. But, it was working around the clock, so to speak. And, we got there. And working backwards from that, it was very much like, what do we need to do? And what are the choices that we need to make here? And then in terms of the features, just to cover that as well, it's not just streaming, it's things like streaming, social interactions on that streaming platform, because it was meant to be very collaborative, sort of server-driven UI for the layouting of all of this. So like if you want to change how the content is being displayed, both
that's
for
the
news and entertainment.
New hot thing.
Oh yeah, very much so. It wasn't RSCs, but it was server-driven sort of UI layouting with sort of JSON blobs being sent. And what else? Things like polling on the site, and a lot of these functionalities that go into almost like a full-scale media platform for like a news platform or something. They really wanted a quick time to market. And so, a lot of strategic tech decisions we had to make early on. One of the things that we thought was we suddenly had a tight deadline, and we had about 13 different developers starting off in one go. And so, one of the conversations was, well, how do we actually structure and architect this effectively so that it scales? And people are working on this at the same exact time as each other. How do we make sure that people aren't always constantly stepping on each other's toes, and they're kind of empowered to build and deliver independently as much as possible? And then we can kind of bring these features together so that people are not blocking each other at every single crossroads effectively. So one of the questions that we had to ask, and it's great to go over this with you, I think, is to go with a monorepo or not to go with a monorepo was a very quick question for us to ask. And then how do we structure and lay out our organization to allow and enable these teams to independently deliver their specific features? I think that was a really interesting question, and we really saw the trade-offs, and I think it'd be good to go through the trade-offs of that.
Yeah, I was going to actually ask you about this because in the conversations, you don't usually hear about the drawbacks of the monorepo. You hear about the benefits. So what are the trade-offs?
There's a lot of trade-offs with monorepo, which is that, you are trying to solve an organizational issue with tech solutions, and oftentimes what that means is you need to invest a lot in making sure that the tech is there and it's refined. And what do I mean by that? You need to make sure that you are optimizing, even with the right tooling in place, you are optimizing for your CI. You're optimizing things like cache, because you're basically storing things that would traditionally go into a polyrepo structure. You'd have multiple repos and things would be more isolated and less data would be living in a repo. You're basically combining all of them together and trying to put the pressure of what would traditionally be an orchestration and building into your repo tooling. So things that we saw was, CI times needed to be kept in check, right? There might be a misconfiguration of a package and it would just not be caching properly. And then your CI times just like go up unnecessarily. Things like making sure you have consistent TypeScript configurations across the board for your different packages and your apps, and making sure that the right environment is attached, because our monorepo wasn't just, front-end monorepo, it was also the back-end logic was all stored there as well.
Yeah.
And then we were sharing types across the board and making sure that you've got the right type environments. Are part of the app is going to be running in Node, but some of it might be running in the DOM. All of these things you need to really configure well. Linting rules, getting the right linting rules set up for these packages. There's a lot of these considerations that you may not need to have when you're having individual sort of repos. But when you go with a monorepo, there's these organizational challenges that come into place.
Yeah. Or in multi-repo approach, you might get into those issues, but the issues are not impacting all of the developers at the same time. They might be impacting just
very true
3-person team somewhere, but the rest of us can just jog along with our projects, basically.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So what we ended up doing was, over time, we faced a lot of those things, and we also had to optimize our pipelines to make sure that we're only really building what we need to build, and we're only like packaging the bits of the packages that we have inside of our app independently. Other things that was interesting was, trying to one of the things that we did was create kind of like sandbox environments for these different packages to be able to develop independently. So, you don't need to plug everything into the main app that's running in production. You can maybe test your features or at least your UI libraries, and using tools like Storybook and stuff like that to basically allow people to develop bits of the functionality without needing to be reliant on other teams' work streams, and making sure that everything is as smooth as possible. So it's choices like that you have to kind of consider, which was an interesting experience to have. And I think it helped us in the end, but obviously it comes at a cost.
The piece about working, allowing to work in isolation, this is a very powerful concept. I think there was a talk in React Native EU, 3 years ago, when Microsoft talked about someone from Microsoft, not the Microsoft, the guy, but someone from Microsoft. Sorry, I forgot who it was, about the React Native tester app that they have in their toolkit for React Native. which basically allows to test in isolation all of the pieces that you are developing.
Yeah, it's incredibly important, especially once your team starts to scale beyond, a few developers. I think it's important to not let them cause blockages in a pipeline that you've got.
So the first decision you make, you go with Monorepo, and you monitor the usage of the CI, and basically optimizing it so that it not slows down the teams and it works properly. What else? What other choices you have to make at the beginning so that you organize the work for 12 people?
So at that point as well, one of the choices that we had to make was what sort of UI styling paradigm are we going to go with? And what do we want to use for our UI components? So there's conversations there around architecture, like how do you structure your UI design system, so to speak. That's something that is kind of irrelevant. But what libraries and what solutions exist there. So we kind of analyzed a few options at that point. We looked at native Wind. We looked at a bunch of different sort of libraries like Dripsy, and of course cell components, even though there's a lot of performance concerns with a lot of these libraries. And we ended up going with Tamagui, which was also an interesting experience. Tamagui is a great library. I really do love what Tamagui is trying to achieve. For me, one of the things that we really had to consider about was, JS, CSS and JS is great in many ways, but it's also really problematic in many other ways. Like going back to the whole like platform optimization conversation, CSS is very good at doing what CSS needs to do. And, one of the thick selling points for me with Tamagui is this concept of trying to respect CSS styles and compile out the CSS styles on web, and not having to like recalculate media queries in the JS layer. Like a bit small stuff like that is very important. I think Tamagui gets that right. So that was one of the things that we had to consider. And then again, that conversation of, do you share the layouts or do you share like individual atoms and molecules and maybe organisms, but you don't try to share the layouting? And given the tight time to market that we had, we ultimately decided to actually share the layouting with mine, with trying to respect things with like responsiveness, but, not really trying to optimize heavily on the layouting and the navigation of the app, trying to keep it as consistent as we can across the platforms just for the faster time to market and the tight deadline that we had. Now, one of the challenges with using a cutting-edge UI library like Tamagui is that docs are not going to be as refined as a solution that's been around for years and years. I think that was one of the bottlenecks that we faced was documentation. A lot of times, finding out the right patterns and what to do was going through the source code of Tamagui and trying to understand what certain props do, which can end up being a bit of a bottleneck for your team. But
I was going to comment on the choice of Tamagui because it's such a new initiative. It's been around for maybe a year and a half, maybe.
Yes.
I want to say. So it's really, really fresh. In terms of production ready. But I've heard many, many good things. I haven't tried it myself yet, but I will right after a recording of this episode. I'm going to.
Do you promise? Do you promise to go over? Yes. Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Nate will be very happy. No, but it is a fresh piece of tech. I think it was one that, given the backers of it, we thought will eventually mature, and I think it will eventually mature into a place where it will be one of the de facto choices for building universal style libraries. And I think we wanted to just make sure we set up jump on the right train. And, one of the benefits of Tamagui was that it is a very quick way to style UIs on web and mobile. I think once you understand how the library works, once you understand the concepts and you learn them, your productivity is massive. Even things like breakpoints are done so nicely on Tamagui compared to, many other libraries that are out there. I think the closest one that I can see is these days, and this wasn't the case when we started looking at these choices, was Unistyles has now become another library, but again, very, very, very new in the space, and so is Native Wind with some of the new media breakpoint stuff as well. So I think stuff like that makes Tamagui just kind of like a superpower. But again, it comes at the cost of trying to learn this technology that's very, very fresh and very, very cutting edge.
I'm looking at my list of questions for you, and I noticed that we didn't discuss something in the broad spectrum discussion. So
sure.
let's try to touch on this piece of this as well. But
Sure.
I was going to ask about the dependencies
Yeah.
and the dependencies that might be different for the underlying platform.
Yeah.
So if you imagine, like from React Native world, we have fast image and the newest Expo image, and
Yeah.
they just import something natively from Android and iOS. On Android, I think it's a Glide library, very fast library for imaging.
Yeah.
That's the same with image. The same is the case with like video player, for example. So video player dependency in your streaming app must be one of the highest priority.
Absolutely.
To focus on.
So that was one of the things that we looked on very early on, was like, we want a video player that, so when you're building a streaming app, it's not just, plop in a video player and, it'll work. It's what video player will support DRM the DRM that you're trying to target, what video players will have the functionality, the accessibility functionality that you want to have, and then the streaming protocol that you want to have. Is it going to support HLS? Is it going to support Dash? What are the streaming protocols that you can support with it? And it's very easy to not look into this deeply. One of the things that you may see is you go on the Expo site and you see Expo AV, it supports iOS, Android, web, and great. And you see somewhere in the docs, it supports HLS streams, and you're like, great, this is going to be a walk in the park, right? And then
no.
and then you actually go into the depths of it, and you go into the trenches, and you realize, well, it says HLS streaming's there, but it's there for iOS and Android, not for web. And these subtle intricacies that you realize, there's very particular features that you need that are core to your business case, and they will not be there in certain libraries, even if they're quote unquote universal libraries, right? And so this is one of the things that you need to iron out very quickly at the beginning of it, is like, check out your dependencies, see which ones are shareable, and you may at the end of the day have to decide, as we did with Expo AV, we may use Expo AV for certain platforms, but we will not be using it for web, because it just will not have the functionality that we need for web, right? It's a very complex streaming application. And that's fine. You create an abstraction layer over it, and you get the functionality that you want on each platform. And that's where you have to hone in and optimize the platform specific implementations. And it doesn't, I think that's one of the important pieces that you're going to have to go into. So I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah. And it brings us back to the same concept as React XP, right? You have different implementations for different platforms, and you just create this bridging layer. I think in my project, we have a similar case with flat list and flash list. We cannot use flash list on some of the platforms. So we just have an abstraction that under the hood either uses flat list from React Native or flash list from Shopify, and we just bridge the two, and that's all. So
no, it's very much the case. Even let's go into the TV world for a second as well. Similar use case. We don't want to use flatlist for TV because it's not as optimized with this very, very minimal resources that you have available on TV. Like, you think Android phones are bad, some of them are bad. TV is a whole other monster. It's we had to create our own memoization and our own virtualization of a list. And so, can you share some of that logic across web and mobile? Probably. And across web and TV? Probably. But you want to go in and make sure that the lists are hyper optimized for TV. Otherwise, you're going to really struggle with performance issues.
Yeah. And probably if you spend that much time in optimizing for TV, you don't want to necessarily bring the same optimization to mobile, because we don't need them there. And if you don't need them there, you try to avoid the cost of maintaining those optimizations for mobiles if you don't need it.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just very different paradigms as well with TV, right? Even the inputs are different. So it doesn't make sense to oftentimes share these optimizations, right? So you hit the nail on the head, as they say.
Going back to your use case, we talked about the repo structure. We talked about the depth of sharing the UI components. You decided you will share everything, almost, even the layouts. Brave choice. We discussed the dependencies
I've
with
got the battle scars to show you if you want.
We discussed the dependencies with the focus on video player, but there are many different ones that you have to consider the same way. So what about the building strategies? We touched briefly on CI as well, so let's go back to it. Building strategies of multi-platform projects. I have my scars from this part as well.
I'd love to hear I actually would love to hear your thoughts first, because I'd love to see how you guys have approached this, because I think it's a place where it's still relatively uncharted territories in terms of standardization across the industry.
Well, on high level, like you said, you have to care about the dependencies. You have to care about the sharing only what's necessary. When you build the TV, you have to think about what components are actually used on TV and what not. And building, we have 3 different TV platforms: tvOS, Android TV, and Fire TV. 2 different mobiles, Android and iOS, and web to add to that. So you have to really pick and choose what level of building and what level of testing you do on each software development step. Do you do all of your tests and all of your building on each PR? Probably not, because it's going to block your PR for hours and hours, right? How much do you do? So we actually have a system to pick the right building scenario and pick the right testing scenario for the level of development lifecycle. So definitely, like for the release level, we do all of it. And then for the PR level, we might do just one platform or just a separate suite of tests and not all of it. So there is a level of smoke testing, there is a level of precision testing, let's say. So you have to consider that.
No, it was very similar considerations on our end as well. Releasing is a different story. Like, you just want to make sure you get it right. So you can go all in on that, but you also don't want to slow down your team, right? With like unit tests running and then end-to-end tests running and then weird integration tests running as well on every single PR, and then forcing a bunch of processes down that will like slow down your team and take away from the benefits of having a universal app, right? That is being quick and delivering with a low time to market. And so we had to make that decision. Like, how do you choose tests to run on those intervals while still not going overboard? And I think it's important as well this again goes into that enablement of your team through the Monorepo. If you have the right Monorepo tools set in place, you're using something like TurboRepo or NX, which I think you really should use on a project that's large scale. Having those tools in place will enable levels of caching for you. That you can have a remote cache that's set up that checks, and if there's diffs between your code, it won't run the tests again. It will just assume that they pass because you haven't touched that bit of the unit test, or you haven't touched that specific package. So it'll cache some of those tasks for you and save it when you've got several different packages and several different apps that may need building, and you've only touched one. So the tools will help this, but at the same time, you need to kind of think outside of the box. Like, how do I want to test this specifically? So going into sort of like the development life cycle, on PRs, we decided, we're going to keep basic unit tests running. We're going to do like a almost like a bundle rather than a build of the application, to just make sure that there's nothing breaking the JavaScript bundle. But we're assuming that the build, we can test that on a less frequent basis, because not much is going to change in the native dependencies. And then running through some levels of integration tests to make sure that basic flows aren't breaking. That you can run relatively quickly on a PR. It might take a few minutes, and that's fine. That's acceptable on a PR level. One of the things that we do almost on all of our projects is we have an internal tool that actually I've released a version of, but is long overdue for an update, because that version is a very, very, very simple version of it that you can do on just a very normal basic Expo app. Is this concept of like a preview branch. So when you go onto Vercel and you create you push a change and you create a PR, on that PR, Vercel will just come in and comment and say check this preview link and check it out. one of the things that we use is we just create an EAS update effectively. As long as you've got a development build on your device, it comes in and puts a little screenshot or a QR code for iOS and Android, and you can, as the reviewer, just go in, open up your development build, take a quick glance at the changes there, and also functionally review that the changes that the person has made are actually implementing what the user wants. So that's one of the things that we use on the PR level. And then the other aspect is, well, we want to run end-to-end tests. So how are we going to do end-to-end tests effectively? And what we do is we basically use our tool Flashlight. So Theodo has also BAM as our sister company, which is sort of the mobile specialist team. And Flashlight is a great tool because, well, we can test the performance and see, have any of our changes affected the major flows in terms of performance? And conveniently out of that as well, you can run Maestro tests because that's how it, knows how to orchestrate and behave and use the phone to test the performance of it. So we then set up a pipeline to have nightly Flashlight tests as well. So you can go in and every single night you run a few of your flows on Flashlight and you'll get a performance score. And over time, you see on this day, the score dropped from 70 to 50. What happened here? What
are the 7 PRs that went during
through,
that day?
And then you can decide the frequency depending on the frequency of how quickly your team is developing, right? We thought doing it every single night made sense, and it did help us discover certain regressions, which was great. And that was doing its job.
Well, nightly is a very nice concept if you know where the night is, when the night is.
Yes.
In our project, we also run the more tests and performance tests in the nightlies, but we have teams in time zones that differ by around 8 hours. So we have a team in Poland. There is a team in West Coast US, and there is a team somewhere in Asia. So when's the night to run the nightlies?
Yeah. And that's a challenge as well. So, we had our US team as well and our London team in France, much less of a broad time zone because we try to kind of be more centralized so we can coordinate some of these things. But, we had to make that decision, when do we run it as well? But, I think you can generally find that time, sometimes not, which is a shame. But, then it does make it makes the tracing back more difficult than anything. Łukasz is okay, 2 a.m. this time, was this person working or not? And then you go from there. Okay, so maybe these PRs, I guess. So yeah.
I think we discussed a lot of things from day-to-day development perspective.
Yeah.
And I think one thing is left, which we discussed in the previous section of this episode, which is the bundler choice.
Oh, yes.
So walk us through the usage of Metro for web and how this is all playing out for you.
So, the choices that we looked at briefly was Webpack, using Next.js for the website, or using Metro across the board. And then maybe something like Repack, although again, Repack is kind of using React Native on the mobile side with Webpack, and then using Webpack, which I don't think we needed the features that Repack gave us. We weren't looking at something like module federation or code splitting at that point. So why we went for Metro, I think it was this concept of trying to reduce the time to market. Because, when you add another bundler, or you're managing 2 separate bundlers with 2 separate sort of bundling run times, one of the challenges becomes how do you, how does that slow down your team in terms of the delivery speed? And so for us, where we were really, the top priority was delivering on time, because there was a very specific deadline, and the client, really had an MVP mindset of just get this out ASAP. One of the things that we considered was, well, our Monorepo allows us to break away from our bundler choice as well in the long term. We have isolated everything into packages. The app is just basically a navigation setup that will import from the packages. So we could migrate it away to Next.js eventually, but for now, we just want to deliver quickly. Let's reduce the overhead for our developers and just keep it as one sort of bundler and one sort of app that you need to test and manage at any given point. Now, that does come with its own practical challenges and its drawbacks, right? Because, you will not get the same, like you mentioned, the whole Next.js community is driving the web forward, so to speak. Or some people may disagree with that. That's a controversial statement these days. But it's one of those things where it's like that's the de facto standard of how you use the web within the React world. And so you don't have to worry about things like SEO too much. You can get away with having better performance generally on web. And I think the big challenge with Metro specifically was the root of it was performance effectively on web, right? One of the challenges that you have is no tree shaking, which is just like,
So what's the bundle size?
Oh, don't get there. Was that the question that you noted down?
No. I noted down to actually talk to get to talking about Metro in web.
So that was one of the challenges that we had. At one point was a bundle size optimization mission, right? Because it was like, again, web was not our top priority, and this is ultimately at the core of this issue. Web was a secondary platform. The target was really mainly a native app with a web presence as well. We started off with the bundle size, because there's no tree shaking, it could just get insane, right? You can get like 10 megabyte bundles uncompressed, 11 megabyte bundles uncompressed, which compressed ends up being like 3 megs. And you're like, wow, that is scary. But once you dig into it, there are manual, transform imports or different things that you can do, certain libraries, you can just not bundle them with web. And this was something that I spent a lot of time actually chatting with Evan from the Expo team about. What is this vision of like making the performance of Expo router apps effective? And you'll see in SDK 50, a lot of libraries like gesture handler are removed from web by default because you don't need that on web, right? It's a mobile dependency that was getting bundled in because somewhere in Expo router source code it was just referred to as that. So there was stuff like that. There was patching certain packages on web to remove that stuff because it was like we don't need that in our specific implementation. So we actually
have to do a lot of legwork to get some of the drawbacks of not having tree shaking mitigated.
So I think you need to actively keep an eye on it, and that's what I say to a lot of people these days. Is like you're starting a universal app. If you're using, Expo router or you want to use Metro for web, keep an eye on your bundle size. Create a custom script on your CI that just generates the source maps and checks what the bundle size is, and if it's increased by a certain percentage, alert yourself. It's like, don't let this become an issue and then have to deal with it. I think we had something ridiculous like 11 megabytes, and some of it was just like silly. Like it was like, why I've imported a single icon from Tamagui's icon collection, and suddenly there's 3 megas of icons just bundled in here, and it's like
all of them.
Just every single icon, and like one was being used. Like basic things that you don't have to think about when you have tree shaking.
Yeah.
So we ultimately brought it down to 4 uncompressed, which compressed went below 1 megabyte, which isn't it's not state of the art by any metric of the word. But it was acceptable for what we were trying to achieve, which was a web platform that was performant enough to load relatively quickly, even on slow networks like 3G networks, which was one of the things that we were looking at. So we got there ultimately in the end. Now, things like SEO, you will struggle with unless you go with static exports. And, something like static exports, again, is still being worked on and ironed out by the Expo router team. So I think there's still some stuff left, but I would go for Metro if you are in a very similar position to what we were in, which is mobile first, then web. And, you want to just accelerate your team. You have a quick deadline and you want to get there. And I think I would do that with a mindset that I think Expo router will evolve and develop much better performance. And I think it will be a great tool. But you also have an escape hatch by having this sort of monorepo structure if you do go down that route, to be able to take that and maybe put it in an XJS app if you need to do that at some point. And SEO becomes like a cream of the crop for you. It becomes the most important thing in your project. So it was definitely a learning experience for us because, taking an Expo router app to production, especially for web, I think is I don't want to say unheard of, but it's very rare, probably. I don't know.
Yes, I have not heard about the Expo router on web in production app yet. So thanks for that. We will definitely learn from it. You mentioned repack, and before we recorded the episode, definitely not now, but I consulted Rafix and Jacob from our team, who are maintainers of Repack, about like how would you approach using Repack, because Repack is not for everyone. You have to have a use case for Repack in order for you to use it in your mobile app. But then I asked them, how about, okay, so I have a use case in my mobile app to use Repack. How about code share with Repack? So they basically said that Repack is basically just a few loaders and plugins for Webpack. So you could have a different configuration for web, and then you can share a lot of the configuration, but you should not and you cannot use the loaders and plugins that are required for mobile in the web. That's all. So you can benefit from having Webpack on the web and then using very similar configuration on mobile if you want to.
Yeah, and I think for certain use cases, like you mentioned, it's very useful. Like some cases you will need module federation, or you need dynamic imports in prod, which you won't be able to get with Metro. So I think those are all very interesting use cases to consider if you need that in your app.
Yeah. So I think that's all. That's not all. Let me go back to this. That's not all. We'd have to talk for 1 hour more to really flesh out all of the choices and all of the technical difficulties in projects like that. But what's important is that I want to say it is possible to create production applications, like streaming applications and whatnot, with React Native and with some level of code sharing, with high level of code sharing. And it all depends on your use case and on your limitations that you have from your client.
Yeah, and I think there's exciting times ahead. I think I was excited to do this episode with you, Łukasz, because I think there's a lot of hype around universal apps, but until you get into the nitty gritty and talk about what is the day-to-day like, people won't see it as a reality. And I think I'm a big proponent of this. I see this as incredible technology, but I think we need to talk about the whole picture, and I think that will drive us and propel us forward. And the future is very exciting. The future with universal apps is very exciting.
I think the same way. Okay, right now I'd like to wrap it up. It was a great episode. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed talking about React Native multi-platform and code sharing. Like I said in the beginning, this is our bread and butter. This is the main reason why we do React Native in the first place, to get the benefits, to get the time to market, to get the kind of code sharing and knowledge transfer between developers. Recap of the episode. Today, we discussed building universal apps with React Native. We talked about the path of React Native to multi-platform, from sometimes bumpy past to present-day possibilities. And we discussed real-life challenges and opportunities of building a universal streaming platform. So, Mo, I want to thank you really much for being an amazing guest and for sharing your experience with multi-platform development.
Thank you, Łukasz, for hosting. Very, very happy to be here, and hopefully some more in the future.
Yeah, definitely. And also, I want to thank everyone that's listened until this point. Please share your experience with multi-platform development and sign up for CallStack's newsletter for developers and tech leaders to get the top-notch tech and business content, including information about this podcast. Thank you.